Hi, I'm Coode, and I'm here today to talk to you about data privacy regulations, or GDPR, CCPA, and PIPEDA. Oh my! I come from an engineering background. I am a technical person, not a lawyer, but I have been working in privacy for the last 10 years, helping companies and individuals figure out how their data goes online and where it goes and how it gets stored and transferred and retained and how we can do that better. So today we are going to be talking about how global data privacy regulations affect you and your business. To start, what is the difference between security and privacy? So security is what keeps people out. It's the you shall not pass. And we use a lot of castle analogies often with security. So security for a castle would be your moat and your high walls and things that keep people out of your castle. So the privacy is keep it secret, keep it safe. The privacy is keeping that confidential information in. If somebody breaches your castle wall and you're able to throw them out again without them doing any damage, so there's your security breach, they've gotten through, but you've gotten them out, there's no damage done. With privacy, it's like toothpaste in the tube. Once you've pushed that toothpaste out of the tube, you can't get it back in again. So if somebody has a plan for an attack and it's sitting in the castle and you've gotten in and you've seen the plan for attack, well, then the privacy has been breached because you cannot get that back again. The damage is done. So when we talk about security, again, we're talking about access and keeping people out. With privacy, we're talking about keeping, in our sense, data in. We're talking about keeping it secure, making sure the access is limited, and ensuring that that data isn't getting in the wrong hands. So what has happened in the world right now is innovation over privacy, or putting our cart before the horse. Back in the day when we used to develop things, we would develop them slowly, but due to software and the way we can innovate with software, we are innovating very quickly, and a lot of companies are like, let's do the thing where we fail fast and move on. And so privacy has become an afterthought. It's like, let's build this, let's see if the feature works, let's see if people like it, and then after that, if it's good, then we'll worry about other things. And that doesn't work for privacy because, again, toothpaste out of the tube, once you've collected the data, even if you shouldn't, once you've collected it, the damage is already done. So it's really important that we go back now and make sure that we're getting privacy in at the onset stages of developing things instead of after the fact. In 2018, we had a wonderful thing called GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation. It is a privacy regulation that at the time affected the EU as a whole, and it stipulated that we really put the onus on companies to protect individuals. We had never had a privacy regulation like that before, and it was the first one like it. So any individual, it's their rights. It's what would they want? Do they understand what you're doing with their data? Instead of just having the best interest of the company in mind, again, now it's about what does the individual want. In the US, we are seeing a lot of these legislations. So CCPA that I had mentioned in the title, CCPA was first. It was the California legislation that kind of revolutionized privacy for the US, but we are now seeing a number of US states get on board with privacy where they're also stipulating with new regulations about how companies can use individuals' data. And again, we're looking at what are you doing? Do individuals know what you're doing with their data? How long are you keeping it for? And all sorts of other things. In Canada, which is where I am, we have something called PIPEDA. And PIPEDA, or PIPEDA, and you can pronounce it any way you want, it's been around since 2000. So it is way overdue for an update, and that is coming soon. And the first Canadian province to have an update is Quebec. Quebec has released Law 25. It is very similar to GDPR. It has a lot of the same constraints. And so we're looking to see a lot more of that in other countries as well. And again, wait, there's more. If you're in health at all, you may have heard of HIPAA. HIPAA is the American health legislation. Health in Europe is covered under GDPR. In Canada, we have a different one for every province. We've got LGBT, which is Brazil. We've got PIPL, which is in China. So all of these new countries are coming online with their own privacy regulations, which means companies have to now put a lot of pressure on the developers, on their designers, on people who are making decisions to put privacy as at the forefront of what we're doing in the development of new products and services. So when I say data privacy regulations, again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not coming from the legal side. A lot of people are like, oh, it's just a bunch of legalese, it's complicated, it's big, it's unknown, it's a bunch of rules, I don't want to follow it, it's annoying, it's unnecessary, why do I even have to do this? But when we go and actually take a look at a lot of these regulations, that's not the way they're designed. They were not designed to be a set of onerous rules. They were designed to be helpful. And so what they actually lay out is the foundations for you to better protect data, which actually reduces risk. And that's ultimately what we want to do. I mean, we don't want to harm individuals, but we want to reduce risk, because when you have a breach, if you have a privacy breach, or it's not the if but when you have a privacy breach, the less data you're holding, the more secure it is, the better protected it is, the less risky it is. So you won't get fines, you won't have reputational damage. So ultimately, following these privacy regulations, again, is protecting you as a company to reduce the risks when you are collecting personal information. So again, it's not just a legal framework. We want to say that. We say, hey, you know what? It's just like a set of legal rules. What it actually is a design. So, and because everyone needs pillars, these are my pillars. Almost all of the regulations follow the same kind of lines of thinking. So we have data control, which we'll explain, consent management, incident response, and employee training. And then at the bottom of all of this is what we call privacy by design. So just in terms of some technology before we go on, or some terminology before we go on, personal information is any information involving an individual. And so this gets very vague and complicated. So personal information about me is my gender, is my age. Now, if I just told you my age, that doesn't identify me as a person. If you just said, hey, there's a woman over there, it's not like, oh, okay, well, that's Kat. That doesn't help you. There's a Canadian. Well, I don't know. But all of those pieces of information individually are personal information. Personally identifiable information is one or multiple terms that actually identify a specific individual. So going back to that, if I gave you my social security number, or if I gave you my email address or my phone number, those are all unique pieces of information that would identify me as an individual. So that is Kat. Now, if I told you women who live in Canada, that's not me. But if I say women with the last name Coode, which is my last name, who live in Ontario, you might just get me, right? So if you've got a subset of personal information and we combine it, you might be able to render that identifiable. There was a point in the US where if you had a zip code, a gender, and a birth date, you could typically identify someone with just those three pieces of information. So we have to be careful to distinguish between, hey, we are collecting personal information, but it's not identifiable, versus we have it, and maybe if we had enough of it, or if the set of people was small enough, we might actually be able to identify someone. One of the things that comes into play here often, which I often like to call out for people, is gender. So when gender was when it was very binary, when it was male and female, it was easy to use those as buckets. But because we're now including non-binary or prefer not to answer even in a set, now all of a sudden you could have a data set where you only have one individual that's non-binary, or you only have one individual that says prefer not to answer, and then now you've isolated that individual. So we have to be careful that the data sets or the buckets that we're putting data in are big enough to not identify someone if that's the goal with that, what you're trying to do with the data. The other terminology is personal health information, or PHI. Personal health information is anything involving someone's health. It has different definitions under different regulations. In some cases, it's anything to do with a health record. In some cases, it's anything to do with something that a medical professional generated. And in some cases, it's anything to do with just health. So make sure when you're looking at all of these things, if you are making a product or a service that has to do with health, that you're looking at the regulations that apply to what you're doing. So privacy by design, as I had mentioned, is the core and the base of all of this. There are 7 principles to privacy by design. The original privacy by design outline was created by Dr. Ann Cavoukian, who used to actually be the privacy commissioner in Ontario, but it has been adopted by all of the regulations globally, and there is a call to have privacy by design embedded in everything you do. So the 7 principles is to be proactive about privacy. So you don't wait, like this is the whole innovation thing. You don't wait until you've released something. You are proactive about putting privacy into everything you've done. So you're making sure that it's part of what you're doing at the beginning and not something that you're doing as an afterthought. It has to be on by default. So this is where we talk a lot about, like, if you have settings in anything in an app, or you're sharing or anything like that, by default, you're doing the least amount possible. So by default, you don't share that information with another company, or by default, you are collecting less. Let's say you had an app and it collected location. Do you need location? So by default, it should be off, and you should should have an option to put it on. It should be embedded in the design. You shouldn't really be able to use your product or service without that privacy being there. There shouldn't be a way for someone to accidentally not have privacy. It has to have a positive sum. So this is the trade-off between privacy and security. Again, product or service, if you're running a call center, if somebody's calling in and saying, hi, I'm Kat and I'd like to access my account, and they say, great, why don't you give me your birth date so I can verify it against something else? And then a set of other questions. What street did you grow up on? What was your first pet's name? All of that is actually giving away more private information in order to authenticate someone from a security perspective. So there are better ways to do that. So we don't want to trade off privacy for security. We don't ever want to collect personal information in exchange for securing an account. End-to-end security. So we often talk about the data lifecycle. So the data lifecycle is accepting the data and collecting it wherever you get it from. It's transferring it, storing it, accessing it, analyzing it. You really need end-to-end security. I've seen a lot of amazing companies that have, oh, well, we store it here and it's all encrypted. And I'm like, but where does it come from? Oh, well, we mail it in. When we go back to non-tech companies, like a good example would be like a real estate agency. They often need copies of your license. So when they get it, they lock it away in a filing cabinet. Nobody can get a photocopy of your license. But in order to get it now, because of the pandemic, they're saying, hey, you know what, just email it in. So people are using unsecure email in order to put a picture of their driver's license to then email it to an unsecure email recipient, and then it's being printed off and putting in a filing cabinet. So we have to have that end-to-end security, right from the collection to the storage to the transfer. Everything has to be covered. Transparency is about the individual. They have to know what you're doing with their data. And I always flip it and I say, what if you were using this product or service? Like, I'm giving you my name and my email address. What are you doing with it? Where is it going? Who are you giving it to? It's important that your end users or clients or patients know exactly where their data is going, and make it user-centric. Like, think about, again, this is about the individual. So are you trying to be sneaky with the data? Are you doing something in your privacy policy that said we may give this, and then because you're sneaking it off? No, you have to be user-centric. We've seen this now happen with all of the big social networks. They use and abuse data, and users are upset about it. So from a reputational perspective, you want to be a company that has privacy engineering, has privacy by design, and it's embedded into all of the services and things. And again, this goes from like dental offices that aren't technical to apps that you run on your phone. So this applies to everything where any personal information is collected. Part of the regulations as well is data control. So you will hear something called data subject rights. Sometimes they say it's data subject access rights. And that is your right as an individual, which you have as an individual under regulations, to ask for certain things about your data. So under most regulations, you can ask for access. You can see what data a company has about you. You can ask to correct or rectify anything that they have. In most new regulations, and not the older ones, but the newer ones that are rolling out, you can ask for deletion. You can say, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And you can be removed from their system. And you can ask for portability. So if you're like, hey, I'm done with this service and I want to go to another service, you have to ask for that. Now, as a company, you actually have to make sure you provide all of this stuff. So you have to have the ability to receive this request from an individual in writing and say, okay, I can act on this. And in most cases, it has to be done by 30 days. So within 30 days, you need to be able to say, yes, here's a copy of your data, or here, I've deleted it. And again, we're looking at that end-to-end security. So if it's, if you run a financial institution and someone says, I want a copy of my data, you can't just like email it. You've got to secure it. You've got to encrypt it. Maybe you put it in like snail mail, old school mail, but you have to do something safe. And then also in terms of data control, you are responsible for the storage and retention of this personal information. So you have to make sure you know where it is, where the copies are, and that you're only retaining it for actually as long as it's really required. Incident response is really key here. So there's all the regulations will have set breach notifications. It'll say, if it's sensitive data, you have to inform the individual. If it's not, you don't. But they will all have a threshold by which you need to identify what kind of breach was it? How has it affected the individual? Is it reputational harm? Is it financial harm? Do you need to tell them? Do you need to tell the commissioner or whoever your authority body is? So you have to know that. And then you have to have the right communication, and it also has to go out in the right amount of time. So it's important, again, to know which regulations apply, because you will have to have some kind of incident response process here. Now, as I said at the beginning, a privacy incident is different than a security incident. So if somebody left a laptop in their car and the laptop was taken, that's a security incident. Somebody has that. If the entire laptop was encrypted and you're able to like wipe it from a distance and you know for a fact nobody's accessed that data, it's not a privacy breach because no one's actually accessed the data. So a privacy breach occurs when the data has some kind of unauthorized access or change or some problem with the actual data. And then, so just have a plan, really. Like ultimately the number of times I've seen breaches go wrong, because again, people will be breached, is because there isn't a plan in place. And then companies scramble to figure out, what do I do now? Who do I notify? I don't have communication templates. So always it takes much less time and energy and money to create an incident response process and plan and communication templates ahead of time than it certainly does in the moment. Consent is key to all of the regulations. You do need privacy policies, and just like a nomenclature thing, the thing that's on your website is actually called a privacy notice, and the thing that's inside your company is called a privacy policy. But we just say privacy policies because that's how everyone refers to them, and it kind of encompasses everything. But you do need to have statements on your website specific to what you're collecting and how you're using it, and there's guidelines everywhere about how to do that for the different regulations. And I keep saying, know your regulation, but if you aim for the highest standard, it's both better, again, reducing risk for your company, and will cover off all the regulations. So that's really where you want to go. Like if a privacy policy says you have to list all of your sub vendors or your third parties, then list them. Because if you're doing it for California, you may as well do it for Virginia. It can't hurt. And then you've already got it done. And then, if New York comes online in 6 months and they want it, you've already got it. So you always aim for that kind of highest bar and go with that. You do need to ensure you have consent. A lot of the regulations, again, will be looking to make sure you have consent for cookies. Data scraping is a big no-no. You have to actually say what cookies you're using. Often you have to have individuals opt in to use those cookies depending on where you are, or they have to be able to opt out of the cookies. You have to have consent to use people's information in the way that you told them that you were going to use it. And if you ever change the way you're using it, you have to actually go back and ask for consent again. And employee training, this is a really, really big one. So privacy affects everyone. Hopefully that's kind of come through. So privacy affects everyone. You need your customer-facing employees to understand it, because people are going to call and say, hey, I want a copy of my data. And they're going to have to be able to say, oh, okay, I know how to handle that. Or someone's going to call and say, hey, do you have this process? And they need to know. Execs need to understand the importance of privacy, because we need money. Privacy is not a money maker, obviously. Privacy is something that costs money. It costs money to put the policies in place, to train people, but it is something that is worth doing. So execs really need to understand the importance of privacy and why it's something that's actually paramount right now to developing products and services. Certainly R&D needs to understand it, because you are developing, if you're developing software, especially in hardware, it has to have privacy and privacy by design. But this is also your product managers, your designers. They also need to understand it, because they're designing. So when a designer comes in and says, hey, you know what we're gonna pick up? First name, last name, date of birth. And it's like, do you need date of birth? So designer has to be able to say, you know what, we don't need date of birth. Let's just make it optional, or let's use age range instead, because that gives us data and it's not as risky because it's less specific data. And all employees need to know their rights and how to protect the data within the company. So employee training is really key. In fact, almost every regulation requires that you do it annually. So in summary, so you really need to determine which privacy regulations apply to your company and your customers. It could be global. If you're global, then it's all of them. And if it's health, then it's health specific. So it's important to know what you're looking at to make sure that you meet those regulations. Putting privacy at the foundation of your design. So right at the onset, before you do anything, how can we design this better? How can we design this with less data, with better protected data? And then assess, do a data map, always do a data map. So actually go figure out what data you have. And then assess the processing, transfer, storage, and retention of data. Equip yourself to safely handle subject requests. So when someone does ask for their data or wants a copy or wants to delete it, you are able to do that. Update all your privacy policies and consent documentation. Make sure that they're current, that they're actually covering what you do. One flag I always look for is a company that has a privacy policy that hasn't been updated since 2020. And then I'm like, wow, that was before a lot of this stuff came to fruition. So it should be annual. Like if you look at a privacy policy, it should pretty much have this year or last year on it. Or otherwise somebody hasn't been doing their due diligence on a lot of this stuff. and implement a proper incident response plan for privacy breaches, and again, communicate across all teams their role in privacy. So in a final thought, I like to channel Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, especially when it comes to privacy, and it's you were so preoccupied with whether or not you could that you didn't stop to think if you should. So always make sure when you are actually collecting data, personal information, personally identifiable information, that it is information you should be collecting and not information you just can collect. So this has just been the very tip of the iceberg on privacy regulations, but hopefully this gives you an idea of what you need to know for yourself, for your company. And if you have any questions, you can look me up at Binary Tat. You can find me at Cat Coode, and I hope you've learned a lot. Thanks.